السابقون الأولون من المهاجرين والأنصار والذين اتبعوهم بإحسان.
نستعينه ونستغفره ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا وسيئات أعمالنا، من يهده الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له، وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له، وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله. أما بعد. So today then we arrive on the 9th foundation from the 10 foundations for the acquisition of knowledge, الركائز العشر للتحصيل العلمي. We are now on the 9th one. تاسعا صحبة الشيخ المعلم, accompanying a sheikh, someone who can teach you. Remember, all of these are from the foundations, the core aspects needed by every student of knowledge who wishes to acquire knowledge, who wishes to gain knowledge. The 9th foundation in that is accompanying a sheikh, a qualified teacher who can educate you and teach you the religion. فالعلم, الشيخ عبد الله الظفيري حفظه الله تعالى says, فالعلم يؤخذ من أفواه العلماء. Knowledge is taken from the mouths of the scholars. Knowledge is taken from the mouths of the scholars. فالطالب لكي يرتكز في طلبه للعلم على ركيزة صحيحة عليه أن يجالس العلماء. So if a student wishes to base his seeking of knowledge upon the sound basis, a student of knowledge wants to seek knowledge in the right way, upon the sound and correct basis, then upon him is mujalasat al-ulama, and yujalis al-ulama. Upon him is to sit with the scholars. وَيَتَلَقَّى مِنْهُمُ الْعِلْمِ, and to take knowledge from them, to receive that knowledge from them, from the scholars. فَيَكُونُ طَلَبُهُ عَلَى قَوَاعِدَ صَحِيحَةٍ. So then his seeking of knowledge, his process of seeking knowledge is then based upon the correct and sound foundations, upon the correct principles. يتلفظ بالنص القرآني والحديث تلفظا صحيحا لا لحن فيه ولا تصحيف. So when a student of knowledge sits with the scholars in his acquisition of knowledge, in his quest for knowledge, he does so by sitting with the scholars. Then as a consequence of that, he will have the correct principles and foundations in his process of seeking knowledge and what he learns. From that is that he will then pronounce the words of the Quran and Hadith accurately. When you sit with a scholar and you read to the scholar or you listen to the scholar reading, and you correct your text as you go along, then all of those are means to rectifying your tongue so that you can speak the Arabic language properly. You can recite and say the words of the Quran properly. You can read the hadith accurately and properly with no grammatical mistakes or mispronunciation in it. وَيُفَهِّمُهُ الْفَهْمَ الصَّحِيحَ الْمُرَادِ. And the scholar, he will aid you to understand the knowledge, whatever it is you are learning. He will aid you in understanding that knowledge in the proper way, in getting the correct understanding out of that knowledge, out of that hadith, that ayah, that topic, that subject. He will explain to you and clarify to you so that you gain the correct understanding from it. وَفَضْلًا عَنْ ذَلِكَ فإنه يستفيد من العالم الأدب والأخلاق والورع نعم. And on top of that, on top of the fact that you will then have sound principles and foundations that you build your knowledge upon by being with the scholars, and that your pronunciation and your speech, your reading, your Quran, your hadith will become precise. On top of all of that, and the fact that you will gain the proper understanding of those texts and knowledge, on top of all of that, you will also benefit something from the scholars that you may not get elsewhere. And that is the manners and the etiquettes and the piety that you see from the scholars. Their mannerisms, their etiquette, their piety, that righteousness that you see from the scholars in their character, in their behavior, in their manner, in their etiquette, you benefit from that on top of all of the knowledge, of course. And then the Shaykh says, وَعَلَيْهِ أَنْ يَتَجَنَّبَ أَنْ يَكُونَ شَيْخُهُ كِتَابَهُ. And the student of knowledge must avoid allowing his book to become his shaykh. Do not allow your book to become your shaykh. Meaning that you don't actually seek knowledge from the scholars, you only read books. And your knowledge is just in books and you do not seek it from the scholars. That is the meaning of making the book your shaykh. The shaykh says here, do not make the book your shaykh. يتجنب عليه أن يتجنب أن يكون كتابه شيخه أو شيخه كتابه. He must avoid his book becoming his shaykh. فإن من كان شيخه كتابه كثر خطأه وقل صوابه. Because a person who has his book as his shaykh, then the amount that he gets right will be far less than the amount that he ends up getting wrong. The amount you're going to end up misunderstanding is going to be a lot more than what you end up correctly understanding. Because when a person just reads without any recognition of the context or understanding or comprehending properly what he's reading, then you're going to end up with a lot of misunderstanding, a lot of confusion over what you've read. You may read a hadith and think that it means so and so, such and such, and in reality it does not. So the Shaykh says the person, the student of knowledge, must avoid allowing his book to become his shaykh. And whomsoever allows his book to be his shaykh, then his mistakes are going to be more than what he actually gets right. ولا زال هذا الأمر في الأمة إلى وقتنا هذا وما برز رجل بالعلم إلا كان متربيا متعلما على يد عالم. Here Shaykh Abdullah al-Dhafiri says, and this affair of seeking knowledge from the scholars, it is something which does not cease to remain to our time in the Ummah, that the students of knowledge, they go to learn from the scholars, from the ulama. To this day, that is something which exists and remains. And then the Shaykh says, وَمَا بَرَزَ رَجُلٌ بِالْعِلْمِ. No man has ever become prominent in knowledge. No man has ever become prominent in knowledge, great in knowledge. No man has ever become like that. إِلَّا كَانَ مُتَرَبِّيًا مُتَعَلِّمًا عَلَى يَدِ عَالِمٍ. Except that he was nurtured and studied under a scholar. No man has ever become prominent in knowledge except the ones who studied with the scholars and were nurtured from the scholars, by the scholars. That is where you will see the prominent ones arising from. And that is clear when you look at the history of the scholars. Every scholar, you read his biography, he had a whole group of scholars who were his scholars. Then read their biographies and they had a whole group of scholars who were their scholars. Everyone in their biographies, you see that they had scholars that they learned from. And that's what the Shaykh means. Nobody ever becomes prominent in knowledge, becomes somebody superior in knowledge, except via that pathway, that you are nurtured and taught and given the tarbiyah from the scholars in your seeking of knowledge as you progress. So here, Shaykh Abdullah al-Dhafiri, Hafidhahullah Ta'ala, adds the explanation further. He says the biographies of the scholars testify to all of this. The importance of having a scholar that you learn from, or scholars that you learn from and study with and learn the tarbiyah from. The biographies of the scholars themselves testify to this. How many great scholars who became prominent, he says, only did so after studying under a scholar. They only did so after studying under a scholar. Sitting with scholars produces a firm grounding for the student. And if a young student is raised upon that way, it will produce great goodness for him. Just as learning principles and books of the people of knowledge produces great good for him, then likewise physically attending and sitting with the scholars does so too, producing many fruits for the student of knowledge. He will learn from the scholars the correct etiquette in speech, and look at the importance of this. He will learn the correct etiquette in speaking and in not speaking. Meaning you learn from the scholars when you should speak in the first place and when you should stay quiet. When you're supposed to remain silent, when your speech has no purpose or benefit or good from it. So he learns the correct etiquette in speech and lack of it, meaning when to be quiet. And he learns from the scholars piety and good manners, as well as, of course, the sound knowledge. And through that process of sitting with the scholars for lengthy periods of time, and after the success that Allah gives to the student of knowledge, then he will be grounded upon the correct methodology, and he will not be upon confusion or inaccuracies. Hence, the youth who are raised upon this manner will be well grounded, insha'Allah, and will not be moving from methodology to methodology here and there like those who did not have that same upbringing under the scholars. He says, take the example of Ibn al-Qayyim, rahimahullah ta'ala, who initially studied with the Sufis. Ibn al-Qayyim, rahimahullah ta'ala, initially was with the Sufis. But then Allah blessed him to come into the company of Shaykh al-Islam Ibn Taymiyyah. And so he became the student of Shaykh al-Islam Ibn Taymiyyah, and Shaykh al-Islam Ibn Taymiyyah became his Shaykh, and he guided him, Ibn al-Qayyim guided him to the Sunnah after Ibn al-Qayyim studied with him, with Ibn Taymiyyah, and he stayed with Ibn Taymiyyah all the way up until Ibn Taymiyyah was imprisoned, and then he died. Great fruits were reaped from that, from Ibn al-Qayyim rahimahullah ta'ala, having been blessed by Allah and guided to Shaykh al-Islam Ibn Taymiyyah as his Shaykh. How many great fruits were produced from that, from the books of Ibn al-Qayyim. You see now, the books that he authored and he wrote, and that by the success of Allah and guidance of Allah for him, and from the means of that was him coming into the company of Shaykh al-Islam Ibn Taymiyyah and becoming acquainted with Shaykh al-Islam Ibn Taymiyyah. And the Shaykh says, Shaykh Abdullah Dhafiri, to this day the books of Shaykh al-Islam Ibn Taymiyyah are studied and read. To this day the books of his student Ibn al-Qayyim are studied and read. To the extent, some scholars even say, if you've never studied any of the books of Ibn al-Qayyim or his Shaykh Ibn Taymiyyah, then you're not going to understand Islam properly. You're not going to understand everything properly if you've never looked at their books. And the purpose of that statement is to highlight the great amount of value their books have in teaching Islam and explaining Islam. So, a student accompanying an alim, a scholar, is a tremendous affair. So that is the 9th point here that the Shaykh makes, that knowledge, al-ilm, yu'khadhu min afwahil ulama. Knowledge is taken from the mouths of the scholars. فالطالب لكي يرتكز في طلبه للعلم على ركيزة صحيحة عليه أن يجالس العلماء. So if a student wants to be focused on his studying in the proper manner, wants to be treading upon the proper pathway of how he should be studying, what he should be studying, because that is one of the key things. When you accompany a scholar, he can guide you to what you should be studying. And that is one of the calamities that people fall into otherwise, when they do not return back to the scholars. You see all of the people in the West now, It's all YouTube and TikTok and this and that and Facebook, wasting their time day in and day out, day and night, watching all types of videos and all types of clips and all types of things, even if it's Islamic. But that isn't knowledge. Watching TikToks of this person and that random person and YouTube videos of this random person and that random person. And then on top of that, not only random people here, there, everywhere claiming to be sheikhs, but then on top of that, all of the completely random things they talk about. The so-called sheikhs on TikTok and YouTube and Facebook and these places, what they talk about is not even knowledge. They talk to you about all types of worldly matters and worldly affairs, and they'll get involved in politics, and they'll get involved in global matters, and they'll get involved in the rulers, and they'll get involved in all types of these issues, taking the youth away from where they should be focused on. So here, the Shaykh says, a person, a student of knowledge, in order to understand how to proceed with his talabul ilm, what to be studying, what to be looking at, what to be reading, what to be focusing on, and what not to be giving attention to, he's only going to learn that from the scholars. He's only going to learn that from the scholars. And then that's why the Shaykh says, to do that, عليه أن يجالس العلماء. It is upon him to therefore sit with the scholars and يتلقى منهم العلم, and to gain the knowledge from them, not from random personalities on social media, but to gain knowledge from the scholars, from the true people of knowledge, those whom Allah told us to return back to. فَاسْأَلُوا أَهْلَ الذِّكْرِ إِن كُنتُمْ لَا تَعْلَمُونَ. Ask the people of remembrance, the people of knowledge, if indeed you do not know. The scholars, the ulama, the warathatul anbiya, the inheritors of the prophets. And so one of the benefits from that, or from the many benefits of that, the Shaykh says, your talabul ilm, your process of seeking knowledge will then be upright. When you're studying with a scholar, your process of seeking knowledge will then be sound. The alim, the scholar, will direct you on what you need to do and what you need to study. And your mind will not be wasted here and there on all types of affairs that the people engage in. And يتلفظ بالنص القرآني والحديث تلفظا صحيحا لا رحن فيه ولا تصحيح. And then you'll be able to read and pronounce the Quran properly, and you'll be able to read hadith properly. That is one of the, as they say, bread and butter aspects of a student of knowledge. You must be able to read the Quran properly without mistakes. You must be able to read hadith properly without mistakes. You must have that level in your Arabic language as a student of knowledge. You must. Because otherwise, how are you going to seek knowledge when all of that knowledge is in the Arabic language, in the Quran, in the hadith? All of that is in the Arabic language. So the student benefits when with the scholar that you rectify your tongue and that you make your tongue upright. Where you're making mistakes in your reading, you hear the scholar in the lesson and you realize that's how you say this word, and that's how you pronounce that word, and that's how this hadith is supposed to be read properly. You learn all of that listening to the scholars directly. And even more than that, when you yourself read to the scholars and they correct your pronunciation and they correct your ability to read, that is one of the skills that a student of knowledge must focus on. That is something that is a must for a student of knowledge. So the Shaykh mentions it here. That is one of the things you'll benefit and learn. When you're with the scholars, you'll make your tongue straight, that you can speak properly in the Arabic, with the Quran, with the Hadith, without distorting it and without altering it and changing it and mispronouncing it. And then of course, and this is one of the key points as well, the alim, the scholar, يفهمك الفهم الصحيح. The scholar will teach you the understanding of the affairs with the proper understanding. Not somebody comes along and quotes a hadith and puts his own understanding onto it, puts his own interpretation onto it. The scholar will give you that correct interpretation of it, the correct understanding of that hadith or that word in that hadith, or how this ayah is to be understood and how this narration is to be understood. The scholars are the ones who will give you that correct understanding and comprehension. And this is where the calamity exists from the time of old also. The people of innovation went astray because, not necessarily because they rejected the Quran and the Sunnah. All of the people of innovation, when you ask them, they will say, of course, Quran, Sunnah. But what did they do? They attempted to understand the Quran and the Sunnah with their own interpretations, with their own understanding, their own logic. They tried to give their own sharh of the texts, and as a consequence they went astray. So it is not for a person to come along now and try and give his own interpretation and explanation of hadith and ayat. Rather, you return to the scholars and their detailed explanations in regards to these affairs to understand what the interpretation or meaning of a hadith is, or to understand how this ayah is to be understood, or what this narration means and the context of it. It is not you and I who will decide that. That is from the knowledge that you learn from the scholars, the knowledge that has been passed down through centuries. It is learned from the scholars, and that's why in the University of Medina, it is a type of exercise in many of the subjects that the teachers will give you some texts, and they used to say sometimes, you try and work out how and what the meanings here are, and how it should be understood and what's going on with it. Then afterwards, once you've tried, you then look at the scholars' works to see if you were on the right lines or not. And that's where you then find out whether you were completely wrong or whether you were on the right lines of your understanding with the affairs. You look at the scholars, you return to them and you ask them. As for a person who puts his own explanation down without returning to the scholars, then you are going to end up in error. You remember at the start of this book, Shaykh Abdullah al-Dhafiri said that one of the things he always does is that whenever he writes any book, and this book, what is it, 10 pages? 10 pages, if that. This actual text is barely 10 pages. And yet this small book, Shaykh Abdullah al-Dhafiri said, before he published it, he got it checked by a Shaykh al-Allama Ahmad al-Najmi rahimahullah ta'ala, and that's what he does with all of his books. Shaykh Abdullah al-Dhafiri, with all his books, before he publishes them, he gets them checked. He gets the opinions of the scholars like Shaykh Fawzan, who has checked, and Shaykh Rabi', who has checked some, and Shaykh Ahmad al-Najmi and Shaykh Zayd al-Madkhali and the scholars. That's what he would do. Not say, but I am knowledgeable, I know, I've written this and I know I've made no mistakes, publish it. Not like that. He would put together some works and benefits and writings, but then have them reviewed by the senior scholars in case there was a slip somewhere, in case there was some suggestion somewhere. And so the Shaykh says here, the scholar will give you the correct understanding of the affairs. And on top of that, when you sit with a scholar, it's not just the knowledge. On top of that, you learn the etiquettes of the scholars, the mannerisms, the character of the scholars, how they behave with people, how they interact with people. I've heard firsthand from students who sat with a Shaykh Rabi' bin Hadi al-Madkhali for years and years, how they've mentioned in the gatherings in his home, we observed when people would come to him with so-and-so problems, such and such problems, how he would deal with those problems, what kinds of answers he would give them. And when people used to come to him with fitan, with problems and issues, and how he would look into those issues, how he would talk to those people, they said we benefited a great amount in seeing Shaykh Rabi' over years and years in his home, with the people coming to him, how he would interact with them, how he would behave with them, even people coming who were opposers perhaps, yet how he dealt with them, how he behaved with them, what he said to them, how he spoke to them. They said we benefited a great amount in seeing that firsthand from an alim, from a scholar, getting that experience from him on how to behave with people, how to interact with people. So that is something you learn. And then the Shaykh, he mentioned here that a student of knowledge must avoid making his book his Shaykh. Meaning you don't seek knowledge purely on books without ever returning to the scholars. You must turn back to the scholars for that correct understanding. Ask questions, forward questions. If you try to learn purely from reading, then you are going to end up reading some sections and misunderstanding them. Maybe not focusing properly and you misunderstand some parts, and you're going to end up in error, thinking you've gained the knowledge and in reality you misunderstood what the book was saying. And that could be because of your weakness in the Arabic language, let alone anything else. It could well be because of your weakness in the Arabic language, that you don't understand all of the phrases properly, you don't understand how grammar works, and therefore you misunderstand a sentence when it actually means something else. There can be lots of reasons. So a person doesn't solely rely on books. Of course, books are a part of the process in your seeking of knowledge, but a person does not solely rely on books. You attempt to go to the scholars to seek knowledge with them, or at least if you're not able these days with the technology, you can use the technology for beneficial ways, in beneficial ways. The YouTube, instead of watching all types of nonsense, you can watch the channels of the scholars where they are delivering their lectures. There are online now live lectures, video lectures of some of the scholars you can look at and watch and follow. There are means available for a person to be able to follow with the scholars, so you do not solely make your knowledge books. A person who does that will fall into error. And in fact, the Shaykh says he will have more errors than he gets things right. Because when you're only reading, you're going to fall into error. And not just because of your understanding, but maybe because of the book itself. How often there are printing errors in books. Printing errors. There is one, I remember an example, in fact, even in Arabic language, Al-Ajurrumiyyah, there are multiple copies of that, a book in Arabic grammar. 4 different copies I've seen, every single one of them had errors. Now imagine, that's a book that's teaching you Arabic grammar. But the publishing, when they publish books, errors can be made in the printing process. A typo can be made, an error can be made, and they are made in these published books. That's not the error of the author, Ibn al-Ajurrum, or the error of the one explaining it, but it's the error of the publishing houses, and typing and errors get made. So when you're reading that now, you've no idea that this is an error. You're reading the book and this is the book of a sheikh such and such, and you're reading along and you have no idea actually that's a typo by the publishing company. The sheikh didn't mean that at all. But as far as you're concerned, that's what the sheikh said now. And that's a mistake you've fallen into. If you had gone back to the sheikh and spoken to him or sat with him, you would have realized that's not what the sheikh says. Then you would have realized, that's a typo in the book then. He mispublished this area. And there are examples of that in other places. I remember one time in the book of Hajj, in the fiqh book section of Hajj, they had made a blatant publishing error, where they had said something is halal but it's actually haram. They had said something along the lines of, it is, if a woman wants to go on Hajj voluntarily by herself or something, then it is not allowed for the husband to prevent her. Whereas we know a woman cannot go on Hajj without a mahram. They accidentally put la yajuzu, it's not allowed for the man to prevent her, when they actually meant to say it is allowed for him to say to her, you can't go. They added la by accident, just mistyped it, mispublished it. A publishing error, the extra word la went into the sentence. And so now when you read that, it's, oh, I'm not allowed to prevent her. So then you tell your wife, khalas, go, you can go on Hajj by yourself, no mahram needed. I read it in the book of a sheikh such and such. And this is why you do not make the book your sheikh solely. And then at the end there the sheikh had said, وَلَا زَالَ هَذَا الْأَمْرِ فِي هَذِهِ الْأُمَّةِ إِلَى وَقْتِنَا. And this is something which continues to be the case in the ummah to our time. And then it's a very important part here. وَمَا بَرَزَ رَجُلٌ بِالْعِلْمِ إِلَّا كَانَ مُتَرَبِّيًا مُتَعَلِّمًا عَلَى يَدِ عَالِمٍ. No man has ever become prominent in knowledge except that he did so by way of a scholar. By way of the scholars, by studying with them, by learning from them, by gaining that tarbiyah from them. No person has ever become prominent in knowledge otherwise. And that's the example the Shaykh says you find in the biographies of the Salaf. Look at the great scholars from the Salaf and from after the Salaf. Every one of them always has other great scholars who were his scholars. There's never going to be one where he had no scholars. He's known as a huge scholar in Islam, but we don't know if he had any scholars. That type of thing doesn't exist. Then the last point in the book, the final chapter, Ashiran, the 10th foundation. طول الزمان, a lengthy period of time. Meaning, as a student of knowledge, do not think you're going to become a student of knowledge overnight, or in a year, or in 2 years. Studying and seeking knowledge is a lengthy process. It is not something that happens in a crash course, and now you're a student of knowledge, mashallah, or that you're a scholar now, mashallah, or a mufti now. It takes time and time and time, and years and years and years for that student of knowledge to slowly become more and more grounded. So the Shaykh says here, Shaykh Abdullah Dhafiri, فَلَا يَحْسَبُ طَالِبُ الْعِلْمِ أَنَّ طَلَبَهُ يَتِمُّ بِيَوْمٍ أَوْ يَوْمَيْنِ أَوْ سَنَةٍ أَوْ سَنَتَيْنِ بَلْ إِنَّ طَالِبَ الْعِلْمِ يحتاج صبر سنين. So the student of knowledge should not think, should not consider that his path to seeking knowledge will be finished and done in a day or two, or in a year or two even. A student of knowledge should not think he'll be done from seeking knowledge in a day or two, or even a year or two. Rather, the student of knowledge needs to be patient, sineen, years of studying. سئل القاضي عياض, in fact not Al-Qadi Iyad, I believe it was somebody else, but one of the scholars of the past, he was asked, إلى متى, it should be a Tasturi, what's his name? At-Tasturi, what does it say? Sahel ibn Abdullah At-Tasturi. Sahel ibn Abdullah At-Tasturi, he was asked, إلى متى يطلب المرء العلم? Up until when does a person continue to seek knowledge? How long do you continue to seek knowledge? He said, فقال حتى يموت فتصب محبرته على قبره. Until he dies. And then his inkwell, in the olden days the inkwell and the fountain pens, those feathers, the quill that they used to use, until he dies, and his inkwell can then be poured over his grave. Meaning when he dies, then his inkwell is now out of commission, that's it, he's died, so the inkwell is not needed anymore, so you can pour the rest of the ink over his grave. It's an expression to highlight that a person carries on seeking knowledge up until death. There is no type of cutoff or no type of boundary or level that once you reached it, that's it. Rather, a person continues that seeking of knowledge till death. And that's why when you hear these stories now of a Shaykh al-Fawzan and a Shaykh al-Albani, where people, they went to them and they say, Shaykh, and they say, no, I am only a talibul ilm. That's recorded. You can find the recordings when people have gone to Shaykh Fawzan and he says to them, no, I am only a talibul ilm. And they go to a Shaykh al-Albani, oh Shaykh, and I am only a student of knowledge. And that is the reality, that the scholars are students of knowledge all the way till death, because they are continuing in their process of seeking knowledge up until death. So a person carries on with that process of seeking knowledge. Al-Imam Ahmad said, جلست في كتاب الحيض 9 سنين حتى فهمت. Al-Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal, he said, I continued studying the book of menstruation, female menstruation and the different types of blood, and sisters know about this, how many questions they have. This happened and then the blood stopped and then some spotting occurred and then this, all those different types of situations and scenarios and things that occur regarding the blood of the women, the menstruation. Imam Ahmad said, for 9 years I was studying all of that book until I finally understood it all properly. 9 years going through that topic, looking at it, studying it, that book of menstruation, until I understood it. And that's the difference. Today you get a person who comes along and he says, I've been studying for 10 years. MashaAllah, Imam Ahmad took 9 years in one subject. A person comes along with 10 years, what's 10 years? Some of these scholars have been studying now for 50 years, 60 years. Some of them have been teaching longer than that, let alone just studying. A Shaykh Abdul Muhsin al-Abbad and a Shaykh Rabi' now in their 90s, a Shaykh Ali Nasr al-Faqihi in their 90s. Imagine how long they've been involved in knowledge, 70 plus years, 7 decades, maybe close to 8 decades or thereabouts, involved in knowledge, 8 decades in fact perhaps, 80 years of their lives in knowledge. And a person comes along and says, I've had 10 years, or I've had 5 years, then that is nothing. You are at the beginning of your seeking of knowledge. A person now, the reality of it is, you go to the University of Medina and you graduate, you have now taken the first step. From all of the steps, you've taken the first step. Alhamdulillah, you've taken one step. Now start moving on for all of those other steps to get to the top of the stairs. That is only the first step, 6 years. Then you do a master's for another 4 years, 10 years now, if you include the Arabic as well. Then you do a PhD, another 4 years, 14 years. Then maybe after 14 years, now you could maybe think, okay, I've kind of understood these areas a little bit now. That's 14 years of study. Compare that still to Shaykh Abdul Muhsin al-Abbad and their likes, 80 years. And you think after 14 years now you have the doctor name next to you, you're equivalent to the likes of Shaykh Abdul Muhsin al-Abbad or Shaykh Rabi'. This is where the darajat, they come in, the different levels of knowledge and ability come in. So Imam Ahmad said, 9 years I was studying that until I finally understood it. And then Shaykh Abdullah Dhafiri says, وَلَا زَالَ طُلَّابُ الْعِلْمِ الْأَذْكِيَاءُ يُجَالِسُونَ الْعُلَمَاءَ الْعَشْرَ السِّنِينَ وَالْعِشْرِينَ سَنَةً. He says the smart students of knowledge who understand all of these things, and they understand it takes time and you got to carry on. The smart students of knowledge, the Shaykh said, they carry on sitting with the scholars for tens of years, maybe 20 years, not just 2 or 3 or 5 or 6 or 10, more than 10, 20. And perhaps he says, بَلْ إِنَّ بَعْضَهُمْ يَظَلُّ يُجَالِسُهُ حَتَّى يَتَوَفَّاهُ اللَّهُ. Some of them continue sitting with that scholar all the way up until death comes to that scholar. All the way up until death, they are with that scholar, learning and studying. And there are examples of this. We used to have in the University of Medina, some of our teachers who used to teach us, our lecturers, they were professors, PhDs, doctor so-and-so, professors. And yet, outside of the university, some of those, they were in the lessons of the scholars just as we were sat there in the lessons of the scholars. So now they were all of a sudden at the same level as us. They are doctor so-and-so, professors teaching us in the university. Outside of the university with Sheikh Abdul Muhsin Abbad and others, they are sat in the class as we are sat in the class. This was how it was. In fact, one of them, professor, was our teacher in the university, and outside of the university, he was the reader to a Sheikh Abdul Muhsin Abbad. So a person never stops. You could be a professor, and yet you are still learning from those who are still above you, the scholars and the ulama. So a student continues with that, and you never stop. You never say, I've done my studying, I've reached my level of student of knowledge now, I've reached that now I can just go do what I want and teach, and there's no more studying left for me, I've done my studying part. It's not like that. It's not like the academics. It's not like the academics where you learn and study and do your degree, now you're qualified in that field and you can go do and that's it. Islam, there's no such thing as becoming qualified and done. You are always studying and learning till death. فَهَذِهِ بَعْضُ الرَّكَائِزِ. Now, so the Shaykh says, the levels of determination, they differ between people. And the level of effort differs between people. Some people sit with a scholar just a year or 2 or 3, and they say, I have done enough. This is Shaykh Abdullah al-Dhafiri. He says some people, they might sit with a scholar for a year or 2 or 3 and say, I've done enough. And some students, they might suffice with just the university studies. That they graduate from the university and they say, that's it, I'm a graduate, done. Some people might think of it that way, and that's all wrong. Rather, sitting with the scholars and learning from them is a lifetime effort and does not end. That is what Shaykh Abdullah al-Dhafiri said. It is a lifetime effort that does not end. And I recall when he was teaching this a couple of years ago when we were there, he said you could be in your 50s and 60s and 70s and you are still studying. And we used to see that, like I said, in the lesson of Shaykh Abdul Muhsin Abbad, we used to see old men in their 70s coming with their books and their pen to learn from the Shaykh. In their 70s, old men coming and sitting down and learning and listening from the Shaykh. A person never stops with his studies. There is no such thing, I am now Shaykh or I am now Mufti. I am now, as they are in the West, there are Muftis and there are this and there are that. Mufti this and Mufti that. And where have these people become Mufti from? As Shaykh Abdul Muhsin Abbad, we don't call him Mufti. The scholars, they don't call each other Mufti this, Mufti that. You have the Mufti of the kingdom officially appointed. Besides that, to say he's a Mujtahid, he's a Mufti, he's this, he's that. All these titles, if anyone was deserving of them, it would be the scholars. And then you have these people in the West now becoming Muftis. Mufti this and Mufti that and Mujtahid this and Allama, whatever the titles they give themselves. So rather, sitting with the scholars is a lifetime effort and does not end. Even if you have become, Shaykh Abdullah Dhafiri saying this, if you have become even a student of knowledge, you've done some years and you are recognized as a student of knowledge, or you've become an imam. You've become an imam, you studied for several years here and there, you've now become an imam of a mosque. You are the leader, you give the khutbahs, you lead the prayers, you teach the people. Or you've become a khatib, the one who gives the Friday khutbahs. Or you've become a teacher, or you've become a da'i. Then even if you've become in those kinds of positions, even if you have, continue sitting and learning from the scholars. Continue sitting and learning from the scholars. Present your writings and works to them, to the scholars. Don't say, but I'm now a da'i. I've got to the level I can write my own thing and just publish it. Or I'm an imam, I'm the khatib of the mosque. I can write what I want now and publish it. The Shaykh says, continue sitting with the scholars and learning from them. Present your writings and works to them. And if you are faced with some affairs, whatever different types of affairs and matters occur, then return back to them for guidance. All of this in the context of a person becoming a da'i, becoming a student of knowledge, becoming an imam, a khatib. Still, when the difficulties and situations and different affairs arise, the Shaykh says, return them back to the scholars. Meaning, don't think now you've become a da'i or an imam or a khatib that you are now a scholar. Return it back to the scholars. Stick with the scholars in studying, questioning, visiting them, and do not think you can suffice with a year or two, or 3 or 4 of having sat with them. Don't think that 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 years you sat with them, that's it, you're beyond the line now, you're qualified, you can do what you want. Rather go back to them. Rather make this a constant thing throughout your life, that you continue sitting with the scholars until you die. Do not become self-amazed with what you have achieved, even to the level of a doctorate. Maybe a person is doctor such and such. Do not become amazed by that. You or your need for the scholars is constant and everlasting. And the narration of Al-Imam Ahmad indicates that a student does not suffice with superficial levels of knowledge. Rather, he strives to study the matters in depth from the different angles. How? From the scholars of the past and present, until he understands that affair in detail. So then at the end the Shaykh says, فَهَذِهِ بَعْضُ الرَّكَائِزِ الَّتِي يَنْبَغِي أَنْ يَنْتَبِهَ لَهَا الطَّالِبُ لِتَحْصِيلِهِ الْعِلْمِ. These are some of the foundations that are important for the student to be aware of in his acquisition of knowledge. And then he says, أسأل الله سبحانه وتعالى أن يوفقني وإياكم إلى العلم النافع والعمل الصالح وصلى الله وسلم على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه ومن تبعهم واقتفى أثرهم بإحسان إلى يوم الدين. That I ask Allah to grant success to myself and to you, to beneficial knowledge and righteous actions, and may the prayers and salutations be upon our Prophet Muhammad and upon his family and companions and those who follow them and tread upon their way of righteousness to the day of judgment. And that brings us to the end of this small book, Al-Rakā'iz Al-Ashar للتحصيل العلمي, the 10 foundations in the acquisition of knowledge of Al-Shaykh Abdullah ibn Salfiq al-Dhafiri Hafidhahullah Ta'ala. So we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to make that a means of benefit for us, to benefit from what we have read here, from the advice and the guidance that the Shaykh has given. This is what the student of knowledge needs to tread upon. This is the advice that the student needs to work with. And remember, this is not just the advice of Shaykh Abdullah Dhafiri. It was checked and approved and recommended by Al-Allama Ahmad al-Najmi on top of that. He even said, I recommend the students to memorize these 10 principles and to remember them when you're studying and upon the process of seeking knowledge. So that brings us to the end of this book, alhamdulillah.